Hello, friends, and welcome to the inaugural edition of Grey Talk Shit into a Microphone, otherwise known as the Over the Rainbow podcast. So, I have no idea what this podcast is going to be. To be fair, I had very little idea of what my Substack was going to be before I started that. I figured that it would be something along the lines of magic and creativity and all of the cool ways that I was learning to work with my genius. But until I started channeling this Godself series based on my hypersigil journal experiments, I was pretty much in the dark. So this podcast probably going to be pretty much the same thing. I imagine that I will probably tell stories from my life and from my creative practice and, dispense little creativity wisdoms. Same thing that I'm doing on every other platform at this point. But today, I thought I could come and talk to you guys about what has qualified me for this work. And I don't mean qualified in like a traditional sense of like, oh, you have to have credentials to be doing this work. No, I'm talking about what life experiences led me here. What inspired me to do this? What path have I walked to get to this place? And when I was a kid, I lived in my imagination. I mean that almost in a very literal sense. Every single day, I would wake up and I would not get dressed in my normal clothes. I had like a little dress-up box, is what my mom used to call it, full of costumes and just other kids' hand-me-down dance clothes, discarded nightgowns from my grandmother, all type of shit. And I would put on my costume for the day and immediately jump into some kind of imaginative play. So I spent all day weaving stories, and a lot of times on the side, I would also be drawing, writing poetry, making all manner of art. And these two processes directly and indirectly fed into each other. They were part and parcel of the same thing, of the same motivation to absorb within my inner world and absorb into my personal perspective of reality. And naturally, as a consequence of accruing these specific skills, I ended up being funneled into theater pretty quickly, into acting. Was definitely probably not anything that my family members or even me at that point could have predicted, because I was very gregarious and like always performing, always being a goofball in private and with people that I was comfortable around. But unfortunately, due to very, very early life bullying for my autistic qualities, I withdrew into myself pretty early in life and was just kind of like frozen around people early on. Not like terribly so. There were a lot of kids surrounding me growing up that were worse, or I wouldn't say a lot, but I've seen worse. But still, was very withdrawn into myself and did not feel comfortable being my full self around most other people. And it took me quite a while to warm up to someone new and feel comfortable showing this side of myself. But my elementary school, every single year, each grade level did their own play. So when I got into kindergarten and we got ready to do our first play, I don't remember exactly. I remember reading for the part. I feel like all kids were probably put up there and made to read for these parts just to see who was good, or like who seemed to have any capacity to do it, to root out the super shy kids from the ones who could kind of get up there and perform. Because I had no intention of going out for a role when this play came around. I just remember reading for this part, and I was given the main female role. Like, it was the second biggest role in the play. And I remember being so surprised by this. I was like, really? Me? Why? Why do they want me to do this? I was like so shocked. But I enjoyed it so much. And so every year that we did this play, I always got a major role. And by the time I was in middle school, by the time I was 12, I started doing community theater as well, because I just theater felt so natural to me, and it also felt very essential to me because being on stage was the only place where I felt free to let out the goofier dimensions of my personality and to just be like a little weirdo. Because off stage, I was constantly repressing those aspects of myself, and they were literally poisoning me from the inside. So I needed that outlet. I needed that outlet to be able to release these things that were inside me. It also was just a very natural progression from my curiosity about people and what makes people tick, and also like my curiosity about my own emotions and my own capacity to channel those emotions creatively and to transmute them into something of value. Not that emotions aren't valuable on their own, but you get me. So theater was my favorite thing in the world. And what I didn't realize at the time that I was doing it is that it was teaching me a lot about embodiment, and it was teaching me a lot about channeling. Because one of the things that I often say is that of all of the artists that I've known and worked with, the ones who seem to be the most intuitively, effortlessly creative are the people with a performing arts background, whether that be dance, theater, or even singing. I often find, which I also did growing up. I took voice lessons, and that was a very big part of my childhood, is voice lessons and piano. And the reason why I find this to be true is because a lot of other artists were taught to produce from a more cerebral place. We're taught that it all starts with an idea. It all starts in the mind. And you can see how obviously that immediately starts to hamstring people because we don't always have an idea from which to start. Sometimes the idea comes as a result of experimentation, channeling, direct embodiment, of just getting moving and doing something, of like putting the tools to work and seeing what happens. So teaching that creativity starts in the mind, that it starts from an idea, that you have to have something actionable to get going, it can be a recipe for paralysis. Whereas I often find people who have a background in the performance arts, they understand that it comes from the vessel first. It comes from a state of being, from an emotional state, and from exploring a sensational reality in the body. And this is why years after doing theater, years after I had given that up and focused more on visual art and writing, I started to come back to things like somatics and embodiment and seeing those things through the context of my theatrical background of automatic exploration and imaginative play. And I became really fascinated by the idea of using this sort of like direct embodiment to spark ideas and to generate basically a field of inspiration around yourself where you're constantly discovering new fascinating things or discovering new things to explore. You're constantly being approached with new things to learn and to dig into and to attract your curiosity. And the first thing that I sort of explored that shifted my focus from beginning with an idea to beginning with an internal state was I discovered Zentangling. And if you haven't heard of Zentangling, it is like a meditative drawing technique that's loosely based on how Buddhist monks make their mandalas, which is that you start with this set of different patterns and shapes that you can repeat in an endless number of ways and arrangements. And you basically, it's really like drawing improv because you're doing the exact same thing that we do in improv in theater. And you're just making shit up as you go along and you're trying to make it all work together. And this was like a great starting point for me because early in my childhood, I had learned, I'd gotten quite good at realism. I could produce pretty realistic portraits of people and some animals and stuff and many objects. And this was like largely what I drew. Because I was obsessed with that whole idea of you have to start with an idea. You have to have an idea of something to draw in order to make something. So I was always like frustratingly casting about for something to draw because I was like, I want to be drawing, but if I don't have an idea, I can't draw. There's this constant like sort of backwards nature in how these two things related. And Zentangling alleviated that. I did not need a place to start. I did not need an idea to start from. I could start from wherever I was on that day, whatever I felt, whatever needed to move through me. And over time, as I experimented with different shapes and patterns of my own and started exploring more of my creative vision, the patterns and textures that I had picked up from traditional Zentangling methods and other Zentanglers kind of fell away. And I started doing more and more of my own sort of abstract artwork. But I finally reached a point in my early 20s where I felt like, maybe closer to my mid-20s, because this wasn't that long ago. I'm 29 now, and I vividly remember there being a breaking point somewhere around age 25 where I got frustrated with, I felt like I was stuck in reproducing the same sort of visual themes that I believe worked, that I believed were good and worthy and would produce a good art piece, the things that I felt comfortable assembling. And this is where I really had to confront like the intense level of debilitating perfectionism that I was dealing with. Because I realized that even though I had been drawing for years, I had like a certain level of skill and practice under my belt, I didn't trust myself and I did not trust my creative instincts. I was constantly reasoning things out in my head. There was always long pauses in my drawing where I was like arguing with myself about what to put down on paper, ignoring my first instincts, and crucially, ignoring the sense perception of what shapes my hand wanted to make, of what movements my shoulder wanted to make. I did not trust my body at all to have the ideas. I only trusted my mind's eye. And if I didn't think it would look right in my mind's eye when I imagined it, it did not go on paper. And if I couldn't see where that shape was going, if I just felt a shape in me, but I couldn't see what it would become once I got it on paper, I didn't have next steps planned out, I just suppressed it. I ignored it. And this, of course, made art a lot less therapeutic, and it made it a lot more frustrating. It basically sucked the expressive elements out of art, largely. And it made it just this game of like making good art, of trying to make what I thought in my head was art and what I thought other people would appreciate. And mostly what I thought my inner perfectionist would appreciate. Because I was constantly scrutinizing my own art. You know, it's really true that we are our own worst critics. And constantly, like, if I made something that I hadn't seen before, I just assumed that it was bad. Like, I assumed if I haven't seen it, if no one else is doing it, if there's no even marginal precedent for it, it must be bad. And obviously, like, that was incredibly self-suppressive and incredibly draining to my own creativity. It was a rejection of my own creativity. So I finally took about 2 years off from making art. I did make some art during that time. I'll say I took 2 years off of making drawings, and I made some drawings during that time. And I also did a bit of painting. I would go through phases of experimenting with watercolors and with acrylics because I was trying to break through that perfectionism. I was trying to be more loose with my drawing style by experimenting with fluid media that are much harder to control. It was like directly thwarting my inner perfectionist, which is why I could never sustain it for very long. I would go through short sprees of painting and then I would quickly start getting frustrated. And I would experience like these brief periods of exhilaration where I liked what I was doing, but mostly I was intrigued by what I was doing. I was enjoying the exploration that I was able to have with the fluid media. But then I would start becoming obsessed with the results again and think like I'm wasting my time because I don't like how a lot of this looks. And so like I gave that up. And basically, I think I pretty much did not make any visual art I did do some digital art. I guess I've never been able to totally give it up. I just feel it has felt like that at times because for years I drew every single day. And then I would go through these periods like when I sort of hit this breaking point in my mid-20s where I was not making a lot. And that felt very alien and weird to me and basically akin to a dry spell. And finally, at the end of 2022, I was really frustrated with another creative project not quite taking off, one that I had way less control over. I needed a creative outlet. I was just desperate for some outlet for my emotions and for presence, because at the times when meditation has been most difficult for me, art is my meditation. Like, I'm very good at meditating now, but that's a relatively recent skill. That is a skill that I've built in the last, 2 years. Prior to that, the only way I could meditate was to make art. That is the only way I could be present with myself and my emotions. So I needed that. I needed that back. And at the end of 2022, I started drawing again. And I remember this was truly the seed of something. Because I had this sketchbook that I had bought by accident. I bought it thinking it was a different type of sketchbook, not realize. I thought I was buying a watercolor sketchbook. And when I got it, it was like these relatively thin, it was definitely not for ink or fluid media. It was not, those pages were not going to take that level of abuse. So pretty much the only thing I could do in it was draw. And I noticed that it did take ink really well. It did take pen ink really well. Probably not loose ink, I'm betting. But that worked. So I was like, okay, this is perfect. Nothing in this sketchbook has to be good. I'm literally just trying to use these pages up because if I didn't draw this absolute crap in it, I would end up throwing it away. That's how I was thinking of it at the time. And prior to this, I had never really let myself have a sketchbook because I was always imagining, I had this beautiful vision of this gorgeous book where every drawing in it is perfect frameable art that I would want my non-existent, never going to exist children to see. I don't know. I really wanted something basically out of a movie. That's just not a sketchbook at all. Something that I could publish essentially, even though I had no intention of publishing it. I just wanted that for me because it would bring me joy. And, that was a perfectly fine vision to have. But the problem is that because I didn't want to waste time making quote unquote bad art, I would refuse to do experiments outside of my main good sketchbook. I would just try to make every single thing that I made good, which was that was never going to work out. That's delusional. That is delusional thinking. There are very few artists who can just churn out brilliant pieces every single go. And if they do, it's probably, not going to be very experimental, probably going to be a lot of retreads, a lot of the same, because you're playing it safe. If you're not trying to make a mess, if you're not trying to make bad art every once in a while, you're not being serious. And you're not trying to create your best art, essentially. You're trying to just stay within your comfort zone, essentially. So anyway, this little throwaway sketchbook was the first sketchbook that I had really allowed to be a sketchbook ever in my life. And it was cathartic for sure. I definitely I was still very caught up in my perfectionism of as soon as I started drawing in it and noticing that oh, I like what I'm making in here. Then I started getting attached once again to making a perfect sketchbook where everything in it is perfect and there are no ripped out pages and no rejects. And so I still found myself having similar difficulties and once again sort of confining myself. But it was the most free that I had ever been with my drawings. It was definitely huge progress for me. And then this is where I took things a step further. At the end of 2023, I started this. It was supposed to be a pocket notebook for me to catalog random shower thoughts and things that came to me from spirit that didn't necessarily make sense. It was just where I was going to put any sort of like kind of unfinished, undeveloped idea, or just things that inspired me or that felt resonant to me, or were just like nagging for my attention for some reason. Because I really felt like I needed a space like that to honor these aspects of my shadow that don't typically get to be expressed in my like primary art outlets. It was like an important sort of self-relation exercise to me. So I started this pocket notebook. And around the time that I started this, I got visions of being able to have this level of freedom, but with drawing. And I remember at the time, I was particularly inspired by Yumi Sakugawa's work because I'm obsessed with her art and with her drawings. I love the expressiveness and childlike wonder of her art style. It's just like, it's my favorite thing. And I was like, I would like to be able to do something like that in my own art style. I felt this like desire that had been wanting to be expressed for several years, which was to get messier. I have wanted so badly for years and years to allow myself to be messy. And I couldn't let myself. And, you know, a lot of that comes from my childhood conditioning. But, like, I have a real difficulty in allowing myself to make a mess and make mistakes. But I want that. I desire that. I crave that level of authenticity and immediacy. So I had these visions of being able to have something like my pocket notebook for drawings. And then it occurred to me, I was like, well, the great thing about the pocket, because I also did not have a lot of time to draw at this point. I was engaged in other projects that were taking up the majority of my time. And I really wanted to get back into a daily drawing practice, even if I was only like doing little doodles for like 5 minutes. I was like, anything would be an improvement on nothing daily. And also very sporadically at the time, because again, I did not have a lot of time to draw, so I wasn't doing it very often. So I decided, actually, the pocket notebook would be the perfect place to do this. I will just draw alongside my little shower thoughts. And immediately, the very first drawing that I did in this thing, I was like, I thought it was the coolest thing I had perceived myself to have drawn in like 2 years, 3 years maybe. I was amazed that something like that had come out. Some work that I was really pleased with had come out of me by me trying to make trash, essentially, just trying to goof off. And it seemed like every single drawing I did in that little pocket notebook was the best thing I'd ever drawn. I was unable to comprehend how I was making such good work. And the main thing that I was noticing is that, like, because it's like basically I had gone from thinking in blocks of like, I'm going to put this visual element here. And I had finished it in my head before I put it on paper to make sure that it looks good. And I was constantly like assembling these pieces. I went from doing that to being a lot more like haphazard and all over the place, just drawing like random fucking lines. And like, which to a degree that had always been part of my art style. I wasn't totally planning everything out in my head. It's like over time I got closer and closer to not planning things. And this was just kind of the culmination of that, of me being able to like truly with no plan put lines out. And like sometimes I also like experimented a lot with shorter lines and more like sort of dashed lines and stuff so that it gave me more room to sort of read into the shapes emerging and create something unexpected out of it. I gave myself even more room to experiment within the marks that I was making. So everything that I was making around this time was like blowing my mind. And also like the level of flow that I was experiencing and how fast these drawings were coming together because it was very immediate. It was very much just like me letting my body make the lines and the shapes it wants to make, and then I let my brain kind of figure it out and problem solve afterwards. And this like beautiful conversation was happening in these pieces. And so I finally decided, I was like, I think I'm ready to graduate to a larger notebook. I think I'm going to start a hypersigil notebook where I am channeling all of these sigils and really focusing on the spiritual communion that's happening whenever I make these drawings and when I descend into this state of flow. And weave that together with this like version of myself that I'm trying to channel and create. Because that's the other thing that came from this experiment of like doing these drawings and really allowing myself to fully drop into the meditative process of it and really like sink deeper into my body and the sensations present and allow them to speak, is I started getting a lot of downloads. So many downloads. It was blowing my mind at the time. Like I even got a 5-year plan dropped on me. And let me tell you, I have never been the type of person to write a 5-year plan. I can't even plan the next year of my life. I live in the moment, man. I'm a manifesting generator. I don't be looking ahead. I just let things happen. But somehow, like, when I was just freaking laying in bed after doing my journaling, like, all of this just, like, dropped on me. So, like, part of all of these downloads that I was getting is I kept hearing this moniker, the digital high priestess. And I kept ignoring it because, I think I wrote it in my little pocket notebook, which I was still keeping, like, sort of to the side as, like, these are my like, bottom of the barrel, least sensical thoughts and other aspects of my shadow that essentially don't feel like they're fit for the hypersigil journal. So, like, I think I was talking about the digital high priestess in the pocket notebook at the time, but I was still rejecting it because it sounded stupid to me. And I didn't know where it was coming from or what this was supposed to be. But I was getting a lot of visions and downloads about how my creative work was sort of changing. Like, I wouldn't say dramatically changing. I've definitely been riding this wave of this vision I got in 2022, which is when I started writing my first course that I talk about on Substack a lot called Temple. So it definitely was part of this wave happening. But I was seeing this big shift happen in real time of like how the creative work that I was going to be taking my clients on and teaching people to do was changing based around this hypersigil and all of this various like channeling I was doing both visually with these drawings and in writing. And so finally I accepted maybe I should have looked back in my hypersigil journal before I started this podcast, because I'm not sure if it's something that came out of conversation with my genius when I was doing like astral travel, or if I just eventually accepted it myself. But I sort of accepted this title of digital high priestess. And I'm like, this is what I'm supposed to be online. This is my new role. It's sort of like, I guess, teaching people about magic through creativity. And so that was the sort of seed for the hypersigil that I was creating for this Godself, as I later ended up naming it. Because I look at the Godself, so I look at genius, sometimes called your higher self, sometimes called the daimon. It's called different things in different traditions. Holy guardian angel, it has a lot of names. I look at it as being a layer of your consciousness. So it includes a lot of versions of self, which to me, it includes selves across the spectrum of higher and lower, because really higher self just is what corresponds to spirit, and our lower self is what corresponds more to our soul and our direct embodiment, our physical vessel. So it's all very context dependent. Some people hear lower self and they think that means, not as good as or as genius as higher self, not as like, whatever. They look at it as being a sort of false hierarchy of good and bad. I don't believe that at all. And that's just not how those terms seem to be set up to be understood, even in the literature and in various traditions. But anyway, I look at genius as being this field of intelligence that contains all of the useful aspects of your self and identity across timelines, which you'll hear me talk about Eric Wargo's precognitive dream work and the long self a lot. He is largely who has inspired these ideas for me because of his concept of the long self, which really correlates to the concept of genius and the daimon. And his idea is that this self exists in the fourth dimension, in Minkowski's block universe, where all time exists concurrently. It is literally stretched throughout time. So the information we get from genius comes from past, present, and future. But the important thing here is that the genius contains many aspects of self, many individual parts of self. And to me, your God self is sort of like an interface. It's almost as if you were to create an ego for your genius. It's an interface that you create of all of these various parts that we channel from genius. All of the things that we find useful about ourselves, beautiful, valuable, things that we want to embody and experience more of in our reality. All of these channeled aspects of genius come together to form what I call the God self, which for me was the digital high priestess, as I was finding out. And prior to this, I had not worked with any sort of like manufactured archetype like the God self. I had mostly worked directly with genius. And the issue I had found with working directly with genius is that it's because this part exists across timelines and across time, and because it is very non-linear as a consequence, it doesn't always make a whole lot of sense. And it is difficult to channel that information into something that is directly useful. It's like sort of like going into a disorganized library without a plan or intention and just like grabbing books off the shelf and seeing like what you can cobble together to do something with. That to me is what working with genius directly has been like. So little did I know, whenever I was getting to know the digital high priestess and creating this new self to embody, I was basically creating a process to help people pre-select what is useful to their goals and intentions from the field of intelligence that is their genius. So this is where all of my experiments and embodiment and sort of like going back into my little bag of acting tricks really came into play. Because about 4 months before I incarnated my hypersigil journal, as if you've read my Substack, you know I incarnated an ancestral spirit into this journal to help me navigate my experiments, and I gave it a specific purpose, a specific intention, and all that. You can read all about that on the blog. Before I started my hypersigil journal, I had started this apprenticeship to genius. And this apprenticeship, you can also read about what specifically my apprenticeship entails in my most recent post, but it's a combination of channeled writing, channeled image/sigil making, intuitive movement, energy body meditations, astral travel, all sorts of channeling and embodiment exercises. And all of these experiments were based around the central thesis of how can I adjust my consciousness and my embodiment in order to best support my creative fertility, to create the ideal environment for a productive and fruitful creative life. And this is when I really started to get serious about the idea of like, okay, if not everything starts with like a fully defined idea form, if some things start as like an abstract vision, as like a somatic sense, as something that you kind of have to excavate and enter into relationship in order to flesh out, then how do I do that excavation work? And how do I flesh it out? Like, what actually does that process look like? But as soon as I started doing this work in a regimented fashion, making myself show up to do it regularly, I immediately found that ideas and just excitement about the work was pouring out of me. That was the main difference that I saw, is that I just felt much more engaged with my creative channel. I felt more engaged in my projects. I just felt more excited about what I was doing and more securely rooted in what I was doing and in my projects. And I was in constant contact with my genius, which before had been definitely a lot more regular than it had in the past. I had definitely made progress on this, but it was still pretty sporadic, which, I'm always going to say that things go in cycles. So, of course, it would be very unusual to keep to the same like routine and schedule. Some people definitely do. And if you're into human design, if you're a generator type, that definitely may be more your speed, is actually showing up to the same routine very consistently over a long period of time. But I'm a manifesting generator. as I said. So I definitely go in waves and cycles, and my routine has to kind of change to fit me over time. So I definitely don't aspire to do the same thing and hold the same routine 24/7. But I would say it was sporadic in a way that was not natural to me for a long time, because I just didn't have a routine in place, and I had not really fully decided to commit to this work until like September of last year when I started this apprenticeship. But when I started doing it regularly, and I found that I was much more engaged and in constant relationship, constant contact with my genius, I started having so many ideas. I wrote these like 2 beautiful PDFs for the project I was working on at the time. I was writing a lot of content just in general. Unfortunately, it was not publishable at the time because I did not have a project that it was suited for, because this was really the most personal and original work that I had made to date. There was no like prediction necessarily that this was coming. I was really following my intuition and my desire in real time and seeing where it led. And it was turning into all of this stuff on magic and creativity and the applications of magic and creativity. And so I was writing a lot of stuff that was getting published. I was writing a lot of stuff that wasn't getting published. I was making a lot of artwork and just generally having a lot of ideas. I had this entire vision for a book. This is kind of part of my 5-year plan. So it's probably not going to happen for a while. But yeah, the ideas were just pouring out of me. And in fact, almost to a dysfunctional degree. Like I had to kind of really focus on trying to ground all of this energy and not get into a sort of pseudo-manic state of euphoria where I was not productive and functional because of all the ideas that were coming through. But it definitely solidified for me that this work is powerful. That whenever you show up every day to feel into the state of your body, the state of your consciousness, the state of your environment, and just start there without any expectation, without any plan, the way forward materializes. The next steps assert themselves if you just get moving in a direction. And really, if you focus on moving in the direction of your curiosity, your vitality, your desire, what is exciting to you, what lights you up. So about 5 months into doing this, it was obvious that this was going to be a way of life for me. Like, I had often struggled to maintain my level of motivation for the work. And a lot of this has definitely been to nervous system dysregulation. That's why I talk so much about nervous system regulation in my work, because it is extremely crucial to your creative productivity and, to your mental health, to your emotional health, to your sanity. So like, that was definitely a big part of it, is that I would go through these intense freezes where I basically reached the end of my nervous system capacity for the things that brought me pleasure. I reached a cap on how much pleasure and excitement I could handle in my life, and I just kind of became dead. I had to forego all of my creative projects for a while until I could sort of like get regulated and feel safe again venturing back into my creativity. But this work really helped me it was like good basic hygiene, especially my energy body meditations, which can look a lot of different ways. One day I would like to channel a meditation that I can hand over to you guys to experiment with, because this really is like one of the most powerful practices that I experiment with. But between that and my intuitive movement practice, these practices really helped me to not only stir up that inspiration in my body every day, but move it through my body, sort of even the energy out. I always used to say that after I would finish my intuitive movement and my energy body meditations, I would literally feel like a crinkly piece of paper that someone ironed out. But these practices would help redistribute and sort of honestly purify my energy and ground it. Crucially, most crucially, it helped me to ground that energy so that I could actually work with it, so that it wasn't so volatile and frenetic that it was just like kind of carrying me away or carrying me deeper into my own consciousness and further away from the world, the material world where we can actually make things happen. So now that I had these grounding, nervous system regulating activities in place, I really realized that my creative capacity was now relatively limitless. I was like, I really could be constantly making content, constantly churning things out, within reason. Because again, we have cycles and seasons for a reason. We are not meant to be machines, just creating shit all the time. But I basically realized that now that I'm in contact with my rhythms and cycles, and I'm not allowing myself to totally go dormant during those periods where maybe I do need to go inward and process some things and attend to my roots, but I'm actually showing up to that work and being responsible to my creative channel and the maintenance that needs to take place within that season. I'm constantly engaged in the work that needs to happen in order to get back to the place where I'm making things and having ideas and putting things out. I am constantly engage with my creative channel. And really, to circle back to those stories from my childhood that I told earlier, the way that I was getting myself to show up to all of these practices and keeping myself feeling motivated and inspired to do the work was by leveraging those same skills that I used to live in my imagination as a child, which unfortunately were developed to escape reality and escape traumatic situations, and now needed to be applied in a more grounded and healthy and non-avoidant way, basically. But it was still the same skills. It was still the same skills of mythologizing my life and reinterpreting what it was I was doing. I'm not just getting up to write my morning pages, boring, dead, lifeless, disenchanting. I'm getting up to channel from spirit, to channel from my genius. I'm waking up to study from this dark ancestral energy that I have been given, which is one way that I often conceive of my trauma, of the spirit of my trauma, so that I can do the bidding of this spirit and help other people who are going through this. Or, there are all of these various stories and various ways that I relate to my practices and how I situate myself in the world. And these things are directly energizing for me. They make me fall back in love with the mundane work of paying attention to myself, of being present with myself. Because honestly, for a lot of my life, I have found the task of being present with myself to be extremely boring. Not just boring and draining, but it was actually nervous system activating for me for many years because I had such little capacity for presence and slowness. I've always been a fight-flight girly. Anything that requires me to slow down and down-regulate a bit is a recipe for a freeze state, basically. So using these imaginative, mythological, spirit-led lenses to relate to the work of relating to myself, it helped me to connect with the importance of this work and the vitality of this work. It helped me to see how this work is actual medicine for my soul. And it helped me to reorient to this work as play, which got me out of this perfectionist mindset of doing things right, of what is the correct way to do things, and got me into this mindset of what works for me, what works for my channel, what connects with me, and what is resonant for me. And that allowed me to take all of this information I had spent years studying about creativity and magic and leverage it intuitively. So next time, maybe we'll talk a little bit about what sort of stories and mythologies aid me in connecting to the importance and value in what I'm doing and feel galvanized to do that work, because I think that would be really fun. But for now, this is where I leave you folks. And if you want to learn more about this hypersigil process, about the process of channeling and embodying the Godself, you can feel free to go over to my Substack. That's overthegrainbow.substack.com, spelled GRAYNBOW, because that's my name in there. And you can buy the PDF version of the series, or you can subscribe for $5 a month and get access to all of it, along with the rest of my back catalog and whatever other cool goodies I offer on there in the future. You'll also get access to all of these podcast episodes early. So if you enjoyed this one, definitely head over there and subscribe. Adios, my good friends. Go make some shit.